Chris, when we think about some of the narratives, whether it's AI and just different things that are constantly like coming into so many different stories, I feel like the prediction markets are increasingly creeping into so many different stories. I am curious, as the financial establishment is increasingly talking about it, tell us first about kind of what your mission was. What was your assignment for Business Week to figure out on this? Because we've had lots of conversations, but everything feels a little loosey-goosey right now.
Yeah, one reason I was drawn to this topic is that there's so many different ways to come at prediction markets.
Yeah.
But to me, the most interesting question here was, so these companies, Kalshi, Polymarket, the way they pitch themselves is as sources of truth, that this is going to be, in a world where, we can't agree on what's true, what's real, what's not, deep fakes, what have you. Prediction markets are going to be something that we can trust more than the news, more than pundits. And I was just interested in to what extent that is true. And as it turns out, in a lot of cases, prediction markets can be quite accurate. They're really good at predicting the outcomes of elections, especially large elections. I was going to say
2024, got it right.
Yeah, and especially at the top of the ballot, scholars have shown that prediction markets are a lot more accurate than polls, less so as you go down the ballot. But I was also interested in the various ways that these prediction markets can be flawed.
Right.
There can be market manipulation. There can be insider trading. So that's what I wanted to explore.
We want to talk about those flaws, but funnily enough, as they say, we were actually doing a segment on Warner Brothers Discovery earlier, like who's ultimately going to get the deal, and we did go to Polymarket to see. On that, I just want to mention some headlines crossing the Bloomberg terminal because they continue to come. Warner Brothers says Paramount has boosted its bid to $31 a share in cash. So they're confirming the receipt of a revised Paramount proposal. Warner Brothers says the revised bid includes a $7 billion termination fee. And Warner Brothers says Paramount proposal could lead to a superior bid. And we know the Warner Brothers board still recommending the Netflix transaction. So this continues on. So anyway, these are the kind of things, though, that are showing up.
Is there a prediction for when this story ends? Because this has been going on for a long time.
I feel like it just keeps going over new and new bids. You get into, though, the fraud aspect. And I think we are thinking about people who are maybe, creating a bid or something and has some control over the outcome. That's a real issue.
Absolutely. There's a lot of markets, especially we can get into some of the differences between Kalshi and Polymarket.
There are differences, right?
There are huge differences. Kalshi is entirely U.S. based. It's regulated by the CFTC. So every market that they post needs to be at least run by the CFTC for approval. Whereas Polymarket, most of their activity is overseas, and so it's not regulated by the CFTC. So when you hear about some of the fringier markets out there, like, will Jesus return in 2026? Will the U.S. discover aliens in 2026?
Wait, this is fringy? Wait. Only kidding.
Depends.
We are getting some release from the White House, my understanding, when it comes to aliens, but that's another story. But go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, those kinds of markets tend to be more on Polymarket because they would not pass muster with the CFTC.
Does it make, though, the other stuff that's on any less real? I don't know. I don't even know how to, how do you gauge the credibility of what's
the credibility
here?
Of what? Like if Jesus is back, or what?
So part of the
is it just a game?
Yeah, I would say.
Is there any real information? Are there people who know what the outcome? And this goes back to.
There's a spectrum of markets here, so.
Okay.
You'll not be surprised to learn that these companies, Kalshi, Polymarket, they like to emphasize the more serious markets where you can predict the outcome of elections, or you can predict what inflation is going to be, or what the Fed is going to do next quarter. And they argue that those markets actually can provide useful predictive information to help people make decisions in the world. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is much more kind of almost entertainment, like predicting whether aliens are going to appear.
Well, there's also the sports betting part of this, or maybe predicting outcomes of sporting events. I don't want to say betting because I don't know if it is betting, but you have told me in the past that in reporting this story, you did place a bet on one of these, right, for the Patriots?
Yeah. turned out to be a huge mistake. But yes, this is so. The vast majority of the activity that happens on Kalshi is sports betting, and I think it's okay to use that word. Something like 80 or 90% of Kalshi is sports. Polymarket, 100% of its U.S. activity is sports focused. Overseas is a different story.
So 100% of what you see on Polymarket in the US is sports focused.
Correct.
Okay.
Because those are the only markets they've gotten approved by the CFTC.
So then why are people using that instead of FanDuel or DraftKings?
Part of it is just the interface is a lot simpler. Like if you go onto FanDuel or DraftKings, there's a lot of complex measurements, and you have to know what a spread is, and it gives you the options to parlay different bets within a football game. Whereas with Kalshi or Polymarket, it's very simple. It's, do you think this team is going to win or not? Yeah. And you can make more complex bets, but it's a lot more user-friendly.
You earlier referenced, and we'll talk about mention markets in a few minutes, but you earlier referenced the accuracy of these, especially at the top of the ballot, and the scholarly articles that have cited this as being more accurate than polling. Why is that? Is it because, as proponents say, people are putting money where their mouth is?
And that was kind of to my question, like
what's unique about
what's the value, and like do they really have some insight that is valuable? Because it was pretty remarkable in some of the elections, right?
Yeah, I think what it comes down to is polling and prediction markets are just completely different ways of collecting information. Polling, you're asking people what their personal opinion is, and polling, especially in the last decade or two, has in some ways gotten worse and worse because of cell phones and who responds and who doesn't. Whereas prediction markets, you're asking a different question. You're asking them, regardless of your opinion of who should win an election, what is going to happen? What do you think other people are going to do? And so really, the idea is that you're aggregating information like any market, but here you're aggregating different pieces of understanding about the election and how it'll play out.
As you speak about this, I'm thinking to a site like Wikipedia that uses the wisdom of the crowd, supposedly. This is also supposed to use the wisdom of the crowd, but Wikipedia gets in trouble for bias. Is it possible to have bias in prediction markets?
Yes is the short answer. And the smaller the market, the more risk there is for bias. Like a couple years ago, when these markets were very small, some academics went onto a few election markets and placed bets, and that skewed the results. And as a result, they said, this proves that these markets are not reliable. But as they've gotten bigger and bigger, the presidential market for the election of 2024 was, millions and millions of dollars. That potential for manipulation has been greatly reduced.
We're talking with Chris Beam, contributor for Bloomberg Businessweek, here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. This is on the Bloomberg Businessweek cover story, his cover story on how prediction markets, Polymarket, and Kalshi are gamifying the truth. Do they need to be regulated? Does there need to be oversight? Because are people, you can make money. So are people gaming the system potentially?
Yeah, there is regulation already.
You're right. You did say there was. Forgive me. Yes.
So the CFTC currently has authority over derivatives trading, and technically these are called event contracts. So that's a type of derivative.
Right.
So the CFTC is in charge of what contracts are allowed and what are not. As you might know, there's this huge debate over whether the states should regulate these prediction markets as gambling, and that would be much tighter. It would probably mean taxing them a lot more than they are currently.
Yeah, I mean, because to be fair, the gambling platforms, the traditional ones, are taxed in a way that these aren't taxed for sports betting, right?
Yeah. I think when you bet on Polymarket or Kalshi, it's taxed as just regular income.
So let's just briefly mention markets. I love the way the piece opens, talking about this, what happened with Jerome Powell and this mention markets around Jerome Powell. That's sort of our audience. Explain what happened with the utterance of a word by mistake.
We only have, unfortunately, about a minute or so.
Oh, sure. So, people know that every word that Jerome Powell says in a speech can move markets. But in this case, you have traders on Polymarket and Kalshi watching a speech, paying attention to literally what words will come out of his mouth. And so, you had people betting that he was going to say the word renovation because they thought he might be talking about the DOJ investigation. It turns out he did end up saying it, but a lot of people didn't realize it until after the fact. So there was this whole debate. Did he actually say the word? Which reveals one of the problems that comes up with these markets, which is it can often be hard to tell what the actual factual outcome is.